Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Well, Michael, we are getting ready to start our next podcast, and to put a date on it, here we are at the end of February of 2025. And I think that's important because of the things that are going on, the statements that are being made, how Trump is acting, how Congress is acting, how the media is acting, the language that is being used to describe Trump. And I thought what we would do is we would take some of the words that are being used to describe Trump and then dig into and see if we can come up with a definition for these various words that we can then use for our podcast.
Yes, two things occur to me. One is you and I are rather amazed by what's going on today at our advanced age. And we've said this repeatedly on this podcast, right? And I'm worried about being duplicative, and redundant and echoing, but you've just said it again. We're living at an extraordinary time. There's a pivot going on, and we're trying to look at it from our experience, but also with the history that we know and bring that to bear. One piece I would offer in that regard is that this idea of getting the words right is not something you and I just came up with or that other people around us came up with. Confucius said this like 2,000 years ago, actually 200 to 400 BC, I believe it was, and he said, he was asked, if you want to get governance right, what do you do? And he said, rectify the language, which means you call things by what they are, and you act in accordance with what your title is. So if you're a benevolent ruler, you act with benevolence. And so he was after getting the words right a long time ago.
Yeah, that's it. So let's take a look at some words that are being used, and then let's try to build a framework so that we can recognize where those particular words fit in a spectrum that would include those words. And so
because confusion about this is causing a lot of our problems and our conflicts.
Yes. And so one of the terms that is being used to describe Trump is fascist. They're saying he's a fascist. So I said, okay, well, there are three terms that are normally used that everybody will use them. And so I want to be sure that we understand what they mean. And then fascism is the fourth one that I want to then say, where does it fit in this spectrum?
So what are the first three?
The first three are communism. Communism is a term that, for purposes of this podcast, we're going to say where the government controls the means of production completely.
Owns it?
Owns it. Owns it. Yes, owns it. Better word.
Yes.
Better word. Owns the means of production, and the means of production is not just capital. It also is people's time. It literally directs people, just as on our island, where people's time was their capital. Under a pure communist society, the government tells each individual what their job will be.
So this is abstract, but examples of this are in Venezuela, where they took over the oil industry. It's now a state enterprise.
Well, I
believe.
The example that I'm going to use is either Mao's China or Stalin's Soviet Union. That's what I'm going to use because in both those cases, neither held elections, and both were dictators. And right. They controlled. There was no capital. There was no ownership. They owned everything, and you did what they told you to do, or you went to prison, or you were executed.
So here's a good example of what are the conditions or details that support an idea. You've limited to communist societies that were quite a long time ago. What I'm thinking of is currently in Venezuela.
That's socialism or fascism, but it's not communism.
Okay.
Because there are still people who own some things in Venezuela.
Like Chevron.
Or like a restaurant.
Yeah.
I'm saying there are still individuals in Venezuela who own small businesses.
So communism is pervasive across all businesses?
Yes.
Or is it just some?
Pure communism. I have a good friend of yours, and he grew up in communist China under Mao, and he had been a U.S. citizen for many years now.
Yeah, this is our friend Jim.
Yeah. But he said when I was 16 years old, I was told that I would be a lathe operator for the rest of my life. So that's what he was told at age 16.
Right.
That was under Mao. So what I'm saying is pure communism. I'm putting that as the left extreme, where I'm putting two stakes in the ground.
Okay.
Pure communism is 100% dictatorship. Okay?
Of all enterprise.
Of all enterprise and time.
Got it.
And how people, this is why I go back to the island, where I say that people on the island, their capital initially was their time. Right. In a communist society, they don't control their time. They're told what to do. Even if everybody on the island ends up starving because whoever has the power to tell them what to do tells them the wrong thing to do.
Well, as they did in China.
And
millions of people starved.
Yes. Yes, the Great Famine, exactly. Right. So then the next one kind of, if you go from communism, the next term that is used quite frequently is socialism. Now, socialism, there's kind of a socialism can be a spectrum within socialism. Right. And socialism is where industry is owned privately, but it's heavily taxed. And individuals' income is their income, but it's heavily taxed.
And regulated.
And regulated. And there's a great deal of redistribution.
Right.
So socialism is that, and there's a spectrum there.
So the way you're defining these terms, things like England's nationalization of the coal industry after World War II was socialism.
What I would describe in England for socialism would be when they nationalized health care.
Right, and they still have.
Yeah, and they still have it.
Yeah.
And so in fact, they call it socialized medicine.
Right.
Now, the people who are in socialized medicine, the healthcare providers, they chose to be healthcare providers. The government didn't tell them when they were 10 years old, you are going to be a nurse, you're going to be a doctor. So there's a certain amount of freedom, but not in terms of the operation of the business itself. It's run by the government. And but you can also have socialism could be where you have a privately owned company, but it's taxed at a very, very high rate, and then its profits are redistributed.
So is it fair to say that this is not a digital question? It's not either or. It's not on or off. It is more or less. So the more socialistic is the more heavily regulated, the more heavily taxed.
Yes, correct. So I'm saying that communism is a stake in the ground at the far left.
Right.
Socialism, there's a spectrum of that falls under the definition of socialism. Then on the very far,
I bet there's another end of the
far right,
yeah.
The very far right would be free markets to the extreme.
Right.
Now, our country was free market, and I'm when I say to the extreme, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. I'm saying that there was no safety net in the U.S. economy for many decades after the Constitution was passed. In other words, no government safety net. There were communities who took care of each other if they needed help, but there wasn't a government safety net, and so people were free with their capital. We didn't have an income tax, for example, in this country until 1913.
And you're speaking of a federal government. There were state governments, but even they didn't really have safety nets.
They did not have safety nets, and so all I'm saying is I'm putting the stake in the ground that people had their time and they were free to spend their time how they decided to do it. Right. And then if that time resulted in the creation of something of value, then they owned the creation of value. Right. They owned the benefits of that.
Got it.
And so that's that extreme. Well, now you have the other word that Trump is being called, and that is a fascist. Okay, and we hear fascism. And so, so you have communism, you have socialism, you have free markets. Where does fascism fit?
Oh, this is a great argument because a lot of people will say that communism is on the left and fascism is on the right. There's others that will say they're both different stripes of the same thing, which is overweening authority.
Yeah.
Absolute authority. So does fascism belong on the left with communism or on the – it's certainly not free market.
No.
So the spectrum that we've done, it's not. But some people from the left think that the right is authoritarian in telling people how to live.
Right. And so this is an interesting question. So if I want to attack free markets, we all know that fascism is bad. And so I want to try to label – you can't label Trump a communist. Because he's not. I mean, you could try, but it wouldn't work. Yeah. Can't really call him a socialist because we know what socialism is. But by golly, he's a fascist because he is trying to do what? He's trying to control our government and say, okay, well, he's trying to shrink our government. So how is somebody who's trying to move us more toward a free market a fascist if Hitler is an example of a real fascist, or Mussolini was a real fascist? And fascism, in fact, if you go look at the dictionary definition, it's where the means of production is owned privately, but the determination of how the means of production is deployed is determined by the government.
Well, it seems to me this word fascist is an emotional word.
Yes.
First, okay, so some people use it just as an outburst of anger.
Yeah.
And it's like the word liar. If I call you a liar, first of all, I'm mad at you, okay? But I don't really have a solid grasp on what a lie is and therefore what the truth is, or vice versa, what the truth is and therefore what a lie is. That's a complicated subject.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really matter if I call you liar. It means I don't like what you said.
That's good. So I may say something you disagree with, and so your response
is that you're a liar.
You're a liar.
And that gets bound up in all this misinformation and disinformation, and we could chase that rabbit down that. It's a productive one in a philosophy class, but that problem is causing us a lot of grief right now.
Well, but that gets into kind of the second phase of these questions, where communism is on the far left, free markets are on the far right, socialism depends on how much redistribution there is, determines whether they're farther to the left or farther to the right.
Right.
Fascism is a term that's being used right now to try to disparage somebody who is actually trying to shrink the size of government.
Yeah.
But that gets into the question of the so-called misinformation and disinformation. So, Mike, what I want to do is I want to explore with you freedom of speech in a communist society is not allowed.
So let's go back a second. I want to make sure we cover this because one of the disputes that's going on is how much authority does Trump have to do the things that he's doing?
Okay.
That's a legitimate question, okay, because the Constitution allocates authority. He's doing a lot of things that are testing the reaches of that authority.
Yeah. Now, but the authority, and you're making a very strong point where he is saying, I have the authority to do what?
To fire inspectors general.
Yes.
To fire a whole agency.
Yes.
And we've had for 100 years this growth of all of these agencies that are supposedly independent of the executive. And the argument is that's not constitutional. The executive has all the authority in the executive branch. That's going to be tested in the courts. I think Trump is doing this intentionally. Mm-hmm. He may lose on some of it. And you may notice that his I've read about a lot of these. I haven't read every one of his executive orders, but they say consistent with law.
Okay.
And so these will be tested in the courts. He's going to lose some of them, but he is actually doing us a service by defining what is the extent of his authority and the limits of his authority. And so we won't have these nebulous, it's your responsibility, but it's not your authority to do anything about.
Well, and here's the interesting question about what we're talking about right now. You have Trump, who, as you, I think, correctly say, what Trump is trying to do is he's trying to fire certain people and perhaps replace them. In other cases, he's trying to fire people and close entire agencies,
right.
Meaning he's not going to replace them at all.
Got it.
He's going to just shrink the size of government. Who is on the other side of the issue?
I don't understand the question. I mean, who's being affected by it? Or
no, who is suing? Who is suing, saying Trump does not have? When Trump signs an executive order saying I'm going to close an agency, the employees of the agency are more or less what they're trying to claim is they have a constitutional right to exist. And
as an employee?
Yeah, as an agency, and therefore their job. They have you do not have, Mr. President, you do not have the constitutional right to close an agency in the executive branch because Congress appropriated the money for the executive branch agency.
So in law, there's a concept called standing, and you can't sue because I don't like what you did to your wife. I can't sue you for that.
Right.
I don't have standing. So who would have standing on this? Congress might if they say you're usurping our authority. But then the argument still is, what does the Constitution say about who gets this authority?
Right.
And is Congress encroaching on the executive branch by creating these dozens of agencies and saying the president doesn't have control of them?
Right. And there was a court case, Mike, this is from the Wall Street Journal, and it's William McGurn writes an article about a court case in 1988. And in that court case, the court case is Morrison versus Olson. And I'm going to quote here. The Supreme Court upheld the appointment of an independent counsel to investigate a former Justice Department official. Scalia, a Supreme Court justice at the time, wrote a dissenting opinion. By the way, the case was decided 7-1. This article says Scalia found that to be absurd, that a man exercising prosecutorial power, meaning executive power, could largely be unaccountable to either the Attorney General or the President. And so Scalia wrote a dissent. The Constitution says, quote, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. He goes on and says, it does not mean some of the executive power, but all of the executive power.
And it doesn't say the president and his pals or his appointees, it's his.
Right. It's
one
his.
Person, yeah.
It is the president.
Or hers.
But it's a president.
Right.
Whoever is president has power over the executive branch. And we've been talking about how our Constitution is set up where you have three co-equal branches. And Congress's primary responsibility has to do with taxes and spending. The president cannot raise taxes. The president cannot spend money that's not been appropriated by Congress. Congress has the authority to tax and spend. Now, the president does get to sign or veto the legislation, but the president can't create the legislation and sign it into law all by himself. And
by the way, I would pick at the word co-equal as I hear you talking.
Okay.
You know, we're big into equality, but they're not the same. They don't have the same powers and the same limitations. So in my view, that means they're not equal.
Well,
right?
I guess it depends.
They're balanced. They're balanced.
Okay, so
I think they're not equal.
We'll use that, but I mean, but they are separate.
They're separate.
They have this. You know, it's kind of like that great commercial of the tattoo guy says, "Stay in your lane, bro."
So they balance each other. They have. I think the idea is it's like rock, paper, scissors. You know, each one has the ability to control the other, and that's a vital aspect of our Constitution.
Control up to a point.
Up to a point.
Each one is supposed to have.
They have
each
checks
one is
and
supposed
balances
to have,
on the other, but they don't dictate the other.
Well, that's now the question.
Yes.
And that's what's going to be so interesting.
It's being tested now.
Yes, being tested. Now, the other part of our Constitution, because we are a constitutional republic, is our Constitution says here are the powers that the federal government has, and all the powers that are not given to the federal government are, by definition, left to the states. Now, back in the 1930s, we've talked about this before, that way of thinking about the relationship between the federal government and the states started to erode. And now we're to the point where I don't think there's hardly anything that Congress doesn't think it has the power to do.
To address. And so some examples of things like that are education. It used to be states only, right? Police power. I think lawyers would say the police power has traditionally was with the states. Now the FBI prosecutes crimes. Federal crime is an increasingly broad category of things, I believe. Mm-hmm. Not a lawyer, but I think that's true. What are some other things that used to be reserved to the states? The general welfare?
Oh, well, I mean, Eisenhower in the 50s, Congress and Eisenhower wanted to have an interstate highway system. Neither believed that they had the authority under the Constitution to pass a giant infrastructure bill. They didn't think they had the power to do that, so they put it under a Defense Department appropriation. And their claim was that if we go to war, we have to be able to move troops rapidly around our country to defend ourselves.
Yes.
So we need roads to do that.
Yes.
And so they built the original interstate system was built under a defense appropriation.
Right.
And so Social Security in the 1930s, Social Security was considered. The idea of Social Security was considered unconstitutional until Roosevelt threatened to pack the courts. Now,
which means to appoint new justices that would dilute the effect of the current justices.
Additional justices, yes, additional justices. And he wanted to appoint 6 new justices.
Moving from 9 to 15?
Yes, and that would then give him a clear majority to do whatever he wanted to. And they would say, and the reason that got voted down, even though the Democrats controlled Congress, there were a lot of Democrats who said, we don't want the Supreme Court to be a rubber stamp of the executive branch. And they also said, if Roosevelt can add 6 then the next Republican can add 12 more, and then it becomes a joke.
Well, and we've had this exact argument recently with appointees and some allegations that the court is not now fair and it needs to be diluted. That was under the Biden administration, right?
Yes.
And so one other theme there is that it's not a political branch. It's not supposed to reflect the wishes of the people. Those are supposed to be reflected through the Congress.
Right. In fact, the Supreme Court, the Constitution says they're going to be appointed for life for a reason, so that they never had to respond. The goal was for them never to have to respond to political pressure.
Right.
And their salaries could not be cut while they were serving. Right. So there are a number of things that the Constitution did to try to make the Supreme Court and they can only, the Supreme Court can only take up cases that are brought to them. So the Supreme Court cannot decide, well, I don't like that, and then pass its own ruling. They have to wait until a case is brought to them about the subject.
Right.
And so it'll be interesting to see, because these cases that you're talking about, and these where Trump is firing 17, and here's the issue: he fired 17 inspector generals without giving Congress 30 days notice,
right? Because
the bill apparently said that. And so the question is, well, why does the president have to give 30 days notice to fire somebody who doesn't work for Congress?
Right.
Because the president cannot tell members of Congress to fire their staff members or to hire certain people. That's within the purview of Congress. And so we're getting in real time, Michael, we're getting a great history lesson on the nature of our Constitution, and then taking that and then looking at how Trump is addressing Davos, for example. He went over to Davos recently, and he essentially said, all these things that you guys think are important, I'm destroying every one of them. I'm paraphrasing here a bit, but not by much. And they just sat there and listened. They walked out on him when he went to Davos after he was elected in 2016. This time they didn't. They didn't walk out on him. And now you have Macron from France, and you have Stammer from Great Britain, and they're now coming over. And I love the little press conference with the British Prime Minister. One of the press people asked Trump, said, "Well, did he convince you to not put tariffs on goods from Great Britain?" And Trump looked at the reporter and kind of smiled. He said, "Well, he certainly tried." Yeah. I thought that was really something. And so they're both standing there. And so these private conversations that they're having, and then they come out and talk to the press about what they talked about. They didn't talk about what they decided. They talked about what they talked about. So we are going through, Michael, some fascinating times. But I want to add to our conversation this question of speech, because this gets back to our ability as a society to talk about what words mean. Because if you can't talk about what words mean, because it's misinformation or disinformation, and you don't have a right to say that, but I do, where does that fit into the political spectrum on the economic side? And under a truly communist dictatorship, your speech was very controlled, and I think in many cases what you thought. If you had private thoughts that you discussed within your house and somebody snitched on you, that got you in trouble.
Well, even criticizing the government is defined as traitorous.
Yes, yeah, and Ronald Reagan had that famous joke about the person who talking. By
the way, speaking of words, I said traitorous. In case people don't know what that means, it means you committed treason.
Okay,
which is a betrayal of your country.
What was it? Oh yes, and what was that joke that Reagan told about the guy that came in and pounded on his desk and said, you're a terrible president. And anyway, he told that joke to Gorbachev, and he said, you can come into Gorbachev's office and say Reagan was a terrible president. You're allowed to do that.
In the Soviet Union at the time, you could say Reagan was terrible.
Reagan
but you couldn't say
terrible.
Gorbachev was terrible.
Right. And so at any rate, so now we're going to have this battle of language. And the other term, Michael, that is being used is constitutional crisis. Yes. Constitutional crisis. And so I'm asking myself, okay, how would I think about because a constitutional crisis, a true constitutional crisis, it would be on one end of our spectrum, okay, in terms of constitutional non-crisis. So the other side of the spectrum would be that everything is copacetic with the Constitution. There are no real issues. Okay.
Well, yeah, there's always issues. I mean, it's set up to have this continuous discussion and conflict and balance. And what keeps us alive and changing and relevant, right?
Yeah.
We don't stagnate. So I think one of the implicit ideas here is that this conflict is good for us. It keeps us adjusting and evolving and not lapsing into tyranny.
And that gets to this question: free speech. We defend free speech that we disagree with, so that people who do have a controversial idea that actually is good, there's a lot of ideas that are good are controversial to begin with, so that they can be said and debated. And so, Michael, what I want to do now is I want to switch to a graph. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it talked about the U.S. economy depends more than ever on rich people. Now, notice that the time frame is from 2020 to now, to essentially the end of 2024. So, and what this is showing is that the top income earners now, the top 10% now account for half of all spending. Now, I'm going to say this: I believe that is discretionary spending. I don't believe that includes things like food. I don't believe
housing,
it does. It's when people go out and buy things in retail stores that they don't have to buy.
It's an important distinction, and you know, a statistician will look into this and make sure.
Yeah.
We're kind of guessing.
I'm guessing. Yeah, I'm guessing because otherwise it doesn't make because the top 10% don't control
spend 50%.
They don't control 50%.
All the housing and food.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I'm making that assumption. But here's what's interesting. Notice that from 1920 to 2025. Now, during the Biden administration, his claim was, what I'm doing helps the average person, the middle class. Well, look at this chart. And what his policies actually did is help the top 10%. It did. And this is what is so interesting, discussing going back to Adam Smith. And I want to put in a plug, Michael, for the work that we did back in the 80s. Giantsofpoliticalthought.com covers the ideas of some of history's most influential thinkers. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, which the actual title is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. In other words, what conditions need to exist for society to become more prosperous over a long period of time.
Which is exactly what's in question in this graph.
Yes. It's so fascinating because Biden's premise, along with the Democrat Party, was we're going to increase federal spending dramatically with all of these programs, the Green New Deal, the infrastructure bill, the additional COVID money. We're going to do this because it will make the economy stronger and it will help the average person. Said that over and over again. Roosevelt, by the way.
I think he believed it.
I think he absolutely did believe it because he believed that he was the second coming of FDR. Okay? And FDR, by the way, did exactly the same thing. And I'm going to, in future podcasts, we're going to demonstrate that FDR's results were just like this. FDR dramatically increased spending. He lowered unemployment for about a 24 to 36 month period. And then unemployment, once the government spending couldn't continue to accelerate at the rate that it was, just like Biden, we had a depression within the depression in 1937 and 1938.
Meaning the first depression started in the early 30s. And
yes.
Then there was a surge of government spending and alphabet agencies and stuff to make work. And then that kind of ran out. And then there was another depression.
Yes. Yeah. Because once the money ran out to just pay people, many of them were doing, on our island, once again, keep going back, non-productive activity versus productive activity. Right. The definition of productive activity is creating something that somebody else will pay you for. Right. And what Roosevelt did was he paid people, for example, under his agricultural control, he paid farmers not to grow anything. And by the way, the result of that was that many of the sharecroppers and tenant farmers became completely unemployed. And many of them were black people, because black people were sharecroppers and tenant farmers on land that was owned by somebody else, but they actually did the farming and they shared in the profits from the crops that they grew.
Right.
Well,
Well,
now
they had only been freed, about 80 years or something since the Civil War, so they didn't have time to build up ownership. So they were working for other people that owned the land.
Yeah. And it didn't matter whether they were black or white. They all lost their jobs because the government paid the farmers to do nothing.
Right. Well, keep in mind, there's a saying in communist societies that they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why Russia, Soviet Union, always missed its 5-year plan.
Right.
It always had to have a 5-year plan so that they couldn't be proven wrong for 5 more years. And then every year they'd update it to keep pushing the day of reckoning.
So let me test this. I think what's going on in this graph is that we had a surge in spending, but not an equivalent surge in taxation, which would have cratered the economy in its own way, right? So they borrowed this money, and that resulted in inflation.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that the spending, the surge in spending, was for unproductive activities. It was not. It was a surge in spending that would not have happened had it been left to the public to decide if they wanted to buy it. And what I'm saying is that process in the 30s, it led to a second depression.
Yeah.
And right now, that same idea led to this result, which is not a depression.
It's an inflation.
But it is an inflation. It benefits the very people that the folks who are pushing the programs say that they don't want to help. Now,
what I'm trying to connect this to is that this black line that says other 90% of earners, they are the people that are spending a higher proportion of their income on the necessities.
Right.
And those necessities are getting more expensive.
Right.
Fuel, housing, food, eggs is a great example more recently, but more generally, these price levels have absorbed almost all of their income, and they can't save any.
And 2 other things. Health care, including their insurance premium, and education.
Yeah.
Those 2 things have continued to grow at a faster rate than the average person's income went up.
Right.
So that's an interesting picture. But now let's pull up a stock market graph. This is a stock market graph that goes back to right around 1900. And this is inflation adjusted. Now, you'll note that if you go over to that tip in 1929, 1929, the stock market hit 380, and then it collapsed. Now go to the right, keep going
down to 60. Wow! So it went in.
So whoa! Come back over. Right there. No, keep going to the right to 380. I'm trying to get you to 380. Right, right around there. Okay. Yeah. So we went from 1929 to 1954 before the market recovered to where it was in 1929. Now, you could argue that there was a significant spike in the Roaring '20s. So let's go back. 104 was kind of a before the Roaring '20s. Now go to the right and see how long it takes us to get back to 104. Keep going.
That's the middle 20s.
Go past the right. Keep going. Right there. Right there.
So this is after the Depression in '33. They got back to where they were. About 15 years before.
Yes, and so it's important to look at what the tax rates were, what the public policy was, to try to understand over periods of time what drives prosperity. Because the stock market is as close a reflection to aggregate prosperity as you can have any place, because it kind of represents the amount of capital that exists. And so then if you keep going across, so what we see is in the 30s, you see that big dip in 1937, 1938. That's the depression within the depression.
Right.
And that's the one that shows that Roosevelt's policies, far from bringing us out of the depression, didn't. In fact, it brought us a new depression. And so then it
brought a rise for a while, and then it collapsed when the money ran out.
Exactly. Exactly.
You see clearly on that graph. There's a little hill, and then it drops.
Exactly. And it had a big drop. And so now let's fast forward. So now then the stock market, once the war ended, we had a period in the 50s and 60s where the stock market grew very nicely. Even though tax rates remained high, they grew very nicely. And so I would, but the government itself was still pretty small. Social Security was still a very small thing. Medicare and Medicaid didn't exist at all. And the government was still very small relative to where it is today. When Kennedy took the presidency in 1961, that was the first $100 billion federal budget. $100 billion. We're now $7 trillion, so it was $100 billion. So it was still...
So we're 70 times as big in nominal terms after
Yes.
inflation. You could adjust that for inflation, so it might be 30 or 40.
Yeah.
The overall size of government is 30 or 40 times.
Well, I don't know if it's 30 or 40, but at least 10.
Some big number.
Yeah, some big number.
Yeah.
Now, so here's what's interesting. Now you get to keep moving to the right and hit it where it gets to 1,000. There's going to be a little peak where it broke 1,000 in 1966 or 67. Keep moving, and you're going to get there. Right. Well, no. Right to the right there. It hit 1,000. That was in 1972. And so then we go from 1972 all the way, keep going to the right now.
Where it
We go
starts
from
to rise is a
1972.
flat period.
Flat period, kind of up and down.
Back to 1,000 right there.
It took us 10 years.
82.
Yeah. Now, so here's what we need to be looking at. And this is because then after that, you can see how it went up so substantially.
Right.
In the 1970s, this is very important. In the 1970s, we had a lot of inflation. We had high taxes on capital gains, 50%. We had a 70% tax on a top marginal tax rate, and you hit the 50% tax bracket at middle income. So it was hard to make money after taxes on your wages, and it was also hard to make money on capital investments if you sold the asset. And so capital became locked up into investments that might grow at 1% or 2% because the owners of that investment, while they would rather put it someplace else, they didn't want to pay the enormous tax that they would have to pay if they sold it.
And another way of saying that is if they sold it, they would end up with half of what they owned and have to start over at half again and have to gain for another 10 years to get back to where they were, like we've seen a couple of times on this historical graph.
Yes, and so now we get to 1982, and Reagan had cut the top marginal tax rates on income from 70% to 50%, but he cut the capital gains tax rates into somewhere in the 20s. Okay.
So now these people could sell. They own 80% of what they had before, and they could do something more effective.
Right, and they did. And the point is,
that's why the stock market started.
And that's why the stock market went up, and that's why new companies were able to form that did things that were either more efficient than the old companies or did brand new things altogether. And that's where all the innovation of the internet, all of these things, which when you and I first met, there was no internet. If we wanted to look something up, it was actually hard to find.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is living memory for us because I was in graduate school right where we are there at 82. That was a middle graduate school for me.
Yeah.
And, CNN didn't exist. Federal Express was just getting started. Amazon and Google were way 20 or 30 years in the future. So all of this innovation has happened once the cost of capital and the price of risk to try those things.
Yes.
I think of entrepreneurialism.
And that's a key thing. Say that again.
The price of risk was low, so you could try things and fail, and that's the nature of entrepreneurialism. We've done entrepreneurial ventures for 50 years together now, and I have come to think of that as discovery.
Right. And people will risk their capital that they have. They'll risk their capital by investing in a new business if they believe that if it is successful, that they will be rewarded with a very high rate of return.
Right.
But
because they're going to lose some of those.
Yes, and within that definition, it includes the taxes that you have to pay when you realize the gain. Right. And so consequently, when tax rates are high, you can see this graph will tell the story. I don't care what politicians say. I don't care what talking heads say. Reality speaks louder than...
Well, we're talking heads, so we care what we're saying.
Well, what we're trying... You got me. All right, that's true. Okay.
Yeah, we don't care what other talking heads say.
That's true. Yeah, fair point. Now you see the market goes up, and it goes up continuously, or pretty continuously, from 1982, and then keep going. And then we got up right in there, right around 10,000. And so it stayed in that 10,000-ish range. Keep going now across until we get back to the 10,000 again. Keep going. It bumps up to around, it gets a nice little bump, then it goes down. And in 2009.
So this is the financial crisis of 2008 when the housing.
It's called the Great Recession.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, that was caused by some tremendous misallocation of resources based on very, very bad public policy. So let's talk about that just for a second. And this was true. This happened under the Bush administration with the applause, or right term, of a Democratic-controlled Congress. Right. And I'm not saying Republicans in Congress were against it, but the idea in 2000, the idea that if you owned a home, that would create value for you long term was an idea that virtually everybody shared. And so the Bush administration, along with Congress, tried to do things with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two federal agencies that help finance homes.
That's the Federal National Mortgage Association and the Federal something.
Yeah.
They're acronyms for housing finance entities.
Yes.
And those were, again, back to the part of the executive versus the congressional branch. These are kind of in Netherland, right?
Very fuzzy.
In terms of who controls them, and can the president fire them or close them?
Yes, and that's a great point. And part of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was Congress didn't have to appropriate money for them to finance houses, because the idea was they weren't spending money; they were making housing
loans.
Housing loans that would be repaid, because the notion was that housing prices would always go up. And so they
assumed they would be repaid because housing prices would always go up. And then when they didn't, they were in a big pile of what.
Yes, and that's what created the Great Recession. And
of 2008.
Yes, and so what you had this idea that everybody who can possibly own a home should own a home, frankly, even if they really can't afford it, because the value of the home will go up, and that'll help them have more money.
So people were buying houses with just a few percentage, 2, 3, 5, 0% down. They're borrowing all the money.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times those, I think, were called, no paper loans, or they didn't do any diligence.
No document.
No documentation.
You didn't have to prove that you had the income that you claimed. Yeah. And so they were and so home builders then were building homes at a massive rate to meet the demand, because the federal government was financing the purchase of homes for everybody. Well, then what happened was, when the people who were buying these homes actually couldn't make the payments, then all of a sudden, now the federal government, because they would sell these loans off to financial institutions, then the financial institutions weren't collecting the payments, and then you had the Great Recession. But the Great Recession was due because of misallocation of trillions of dollars into a single industry on a notion that turned out to be false.
And so you have institutions that threatened with insolvency and bankruptcy, because they can't collect the money that they're owed.
Right.
Right. And so this developed the idea of too big to fail. If all these banks are going to fail, then the government's got to make sure they don't fail. So there's more taxation to fill the hole,
and
more borrowing at the federal level to fill the hole that they've created with this false demand for houses by people who couldn't pay for them.
Right. And that all happened in that 2008 to 10 period. Now then, since then, we can see the stock market has done extremely well. And so I want to talk a little bit, Michael, at the end of our podcast here, because we've covered a lot of ground. But here's what's interesting. I was making a list this morning. I said, all right, the tax rate, if you hold something long term, the tax rate on capital gains, including the Obamacare tax, is a hair under 24%. And so the federal government gets 24% of whatever the gain is. And I would argue that if you lowered that to 15%, that would be better public policy. I would make that argument. But here's what's interesting. Pensions don't pay taxes on capital gains for the money that they have that they're going to be paying out to future pensioners, and that money is growing. Endowments don't pay taxes, and so they don't make decisions.
These are like college endowments, university endowments.
Yes, and they have billions and billions of dollars. Sovereign wealth funds from other countries, they don't pay capital gains taxes in the U.S. on their appreciation. And then you have IRAs don't pay taxes in the current term.
They pay it eventually when they sell it, but not now.
Way out there. Yeah. And so people are able to accumulate wealth tax-free during their working lifetime with their IRA. Then you have 401k.
Which is by design. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
Public policy by design.
Yeah.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that there's a lot of money that's in our capital markets now where the people who are deploying the capital don't even think about the tax implications of selling because they don't pay taxes. And that is the reason that the stock market, in my opinion, has done so well. And if we keep an innovation, the amount of innovation, and Trump says we're at the edge of a golden age. And if our tax policy remains very friendly to innovation, and innovation covers a broad. Innovation includes making current products cheaper, making current products better, and then making brand new products using AI in ways that I can't even think about. Right. And so that's where we are now. Is we're at a point, and so this is the great battle that we started this podcast with, is over because we are running $2+ trillion deficits.
It's unsustainable.
That is unsustainable.
That will ruin a nation.
Yes, and so then the question is, do you reduce the deficit by cutting spending, or do you do it by raising taxes? And what we've tried to show today is if you decide to if the government and the people decide to raise taxes on the wealthy, then you're going to get the kind of economic dislocation that we have discussed today. And so we're at an interesting time.
And most of what we've talked about is in the boundaries of the United States. We should say this is an international issue because we're competitive with other countries. And if we have better tax policy, capital comes from Arabia, from Europe, from Asia. Money is fungible and meaning it's exchangeable. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you put $5 here and $5 there. You can balance. It's fungible, but it's also highly mobile. And that it flees high tax states and goes to where you can get a better deal.
Yeah. And we'll pick up there on our next podcast.
Great.
Yep.